record. Добрий день. Мене звати Dzulynsky. My name is Raissa Dzulynsky. Today, I'll be interviewing Daniel Bilak, our 7th alumni of the Alumni video series. Daniel is Senior Counsel at Kinsteller, which is an international law firm focused on emerging markets. Daniel is the former chairman of Ukraine Invest, Ukraine's investment promotion office. In the past, he was also director and chief advisor on investments to the Prime Minister of Ukraine. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So my first question is, where did you go to university and what did you study?
I went to, my undergraduate was at the University of Toronto, where I studied international relations. And then I went to McGill for law school, where I studied both common law and civil law.
Okay. What was your involvement in your USO, your Ukrainian Student Club?
Oh, I was involved in SUSK right from when I joined. Then I became vice president, and then in my final year at U of T, I became president of the Ukrainian Students Club at U of T. And so we had, I mean, aside from the usual pubs and Ukraine Week cultural affair, which actually was quite a big deal in U of T campus back then. Don't know if it still is. We were actually quite involved in some of the leading issues of the day. Largely, we started a dialogue. I think it was one of our most important achievements was that we started a dialogue with the Jewish Students' Union on campus. Long before sort of it became popular to or trendy to have these kinds of interethnic engagements. But we thought it was very important for us to have a dialogue because there seemed to have been a lot of myths on both sides of our upbringing. What our Jewish friends were taught about Ukrainians when they were growing up, and what many of us were taught about the Jewish Ukrainian situation over the years. And we started a very interesting dialogue, involved history, politics, and we would go to each other's restaurants and drink each other's beer and other suds. So it was very enlightening, and it was a very rewarding project.
Okay, that's interesting. I haven't heard about that. So my next question is, what's your current occupation? And then maybe also touch on, things interesting jobs you've held or positions you've held in the past.
Well, I mean, the job I have right now is pretty. Actually, it's not mundane. I mean, I'm finally doing what I really want to do. I have not had a traditional career. You cannot plan this career. When I was at law school, this was in the early to mid 80s. My plan was to become a constitutional litigator for the federal government. Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union. And nobody thought that was going to change in our lifetimes. When I graduated, I started work at Fasken and Calvin. It's now Fasken Martineau, Toronto law firm, and I was an insolvency lawyer, which ended up being great training for Ukraine because Ukraine is one big workout. And I was practicing in Toronto. I was still involved in Ukrainian affairs. I started the Ukrainian-Canadian Lawyers Association, which is still ongoing today, I'm happy to say. And we actually got then Governor General of Canada, Ray Natishin, to be our patron. And actually, Ray and I became very, very good friends. In fact, that was the reason that I came back from Ukraine in the beginning of the 2000s. Ray brought me to Gowlings. And we were going to work on developing a practice in international development work, international development law, which was something that was really exciting and new. Unfortunately, Ray passed away in 2003, and that was a great tragedy for me personally because he was really an outstanding guy. But going back to Fasken's, 1991, we had this coup in Ukraine, and I had met in April. That was in August. In April, I had met some young people's deputies who had come over from Ukraine. And we had decided that we would start a Ukrainian-Canadian and Ukrainian-Ukrainian exchange between lawyers to see whether there was any opportunities to do legal reform. And so we stayed in touch. And then after the events of August, I decided to go over. And Faskins was actually they were bought into it. And I was going to head over and see what the opportunities were. Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union, but it was pretty clear by then, October of '91, where things were headed. And so that the day I was leaving, I got a call from one of our lawyers at Faskins in our London, England office, and he said, "Geez, did you see today's Globe and Mail? There's an article there about the Canadian banknote company accessing a line of credit to print new currency for Ukraine." I thought, wow. So no, I hadn't seen that because I was packing. So I took a look, and sure enough, so I called, and we acted for the Canadian banknote company. They were our client. And so I called them up and I said, "Look, I'm so-and-so, we're your solicitors, and I'm heading over to Ukraine today. I saw this article. Is there anything we can do for you?" And 20 minutes, but I said, "In half an hour, I'm going to the airport." And so the president called me, and 20 minutes later, and I was hired to act for the Canadian banknote company on the printing of Ukraine's new currency, the hryvnia. And that was the start of my work in Ukraine. It was really fascinating because I got to meet a lot of people at that time, because this was a nation building exercise. The Ukrainian parliament, it wasn't even really a government at the time. The Ukrainian parliament wanted to have currency, their own currency, as an attribute of sovereignty, so that to show that Ukraine really was a state, and this was an attribute of statehood. And so I started working on that, and then that one thing led to another, and then I started getting more files and people interested, and some clients interested in exploring Ukraine, and one thing led to another. And in '93, I left Faskins and I left Canada to move to Ireland, where I was working for a startup listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange that was doing high-tech joint ventures with the Ukrainian military-industrial complex on commercializing technologies. They had some wild technologies that we hadn't even thought about, mostly in alloys, scandium aluminum, scandium titanium alloys. Most people don't know that the MiG-29 was a welded aircraft. It could do turns that would pop the rivets on an F-18. And the only restriction being the internal organs of the pilots. They could handle the turns. So we did that. It wasn't just in military stuff. We were looking at battery life and chemicals and things like that. And that was really quite interesting. But I was also working with my friends in the Ukrainian parliament on setting up a legal foundation. And we started something, very original name, called the Ukrainian Legal Foundation. And it basically became the catalyst for legal reform. Another Canadian, Halina Freeland, who is Christer Freeland's mother, was one of the founders, along with myself and Serhiy Holovate from the Ukrainian side, and a few other people. And we got funding from George Soros, and we started doing legal reform. We were involved in drafting the new civil code. We were involved in drafting the new Ukrainian constitution. We were involved with helping Serhiy ensure that Ukraine entered the Council of Europe before the Russians did. And we did that. The Ukraine got into the Council of Europe, became a member. And along with that came a whole list of terms of accession that had to be filled out. There was a complete laundry list of basically building a legal system. And so President Kuchma said, well, okay, you got us into this. Deal with this. You're now going to be Minister of Justice. And he called me up and he goes, what am I going to do? He said, I've never done this before. I've never been a government minister. He said, you have to help me. I said, what do I know? I've never been a government minister either. I said, or whatever. He goes, well, you got to come and help me. So that basically, I then left the position with this technology firm, and I got funding from the Canadian government and the World Bank, and I became the chief of staff to the Minister of Justice in 1994, and 1994 to 96. And we had no clue what we were doing, but that was, had we known what we were doing, we never would have done it, because we were completely unencumbered by any notion that what we were doing was pretty impossible. And so we restructured with a lot of help from governments and everything else. But I basically worked with City, and I was coordinating, developing the strategy and the restructuring of the Ministry of Justice, developing a program of legal reform. And we basically completely overhauled the Ministry of Justice along functional lines. We turned it from a Soviet era registration agency into, at least structurally, I mean, we still hadn't turned people's heads into it, but we were structurally we started hiring a lot of young, just recently graduated law students and giving them senior positions in the government. I mean, in the ministry, I mean, because people with so-called experience was the last thing we needed. We didn't need Soviet experience. And so from that, since I was basically the only foreigner in the country that actually had been involved in what I now understood was public administration reform, when the World Bank started a public administration reform program, they asked me to join and become an advisor to the cabinet, to the prime minister, and to the vice prime minister. And so I did that, and we started doing functional reviews and restructuring government ministries and all that kind of stuff. We had a lot more help now than we certainly did back in the early days. And I did that until about 2001, because things were getting pretty dark by then, with the whole Gungadze affair and the corruption from the president's administration. And then, as I said, my Ray Natishan, I got a call out of the blue, and he started talking to me because he wanted to apply for some World Bank World Bank project involving legal reform, and they wanted me to come on board. And so, we started talking, and actually, then he said, "Well, why don't you come to Gowlings?" And so I came back to Canada, and I'd been away for almost 8 years at that point. And, that was a real shock when I came back, because the practice of law had changed dramatically. And people's perceptions of, emerging markets, about Ukraine, about lots of things. And it was, a lot of the assumptions that I brought back with myself just didn't really apply anymore. Even having a conversation with a lot of my partners, not your father, of course, but a lot of my partners, for them, anything outside of the GTA or west of Bathurst Street was foreign. It's just like way out there. And luckily, among my partners were your father, were Paul Grod. So, I mean, we're all at Gowlings together at that time. Bob Onischuk, sort of much more senior to us. But so there was this group of Ukrainian people who at least could find Ukraine on a map of Ukraine and say a few words. And so I did that. I came back. I was back home for a few years, and then, but I was still working abroad. I started a project in Bulgaria for the United Nations and the EU on drafting an administrative procedure code for Bulgaria, based on my experience in Ukraine. Did a big anti-corruption assessment for them, and actually, my one big success in doing all of these things was that they actually passed the Bulgarian administrative procedure code that my project had drafted, which actually has now become. I brought it back, I translated it, and it's now, through a number of iterations, become the model, or the genesis anyway. There's been a lot of changes for the new administrative procedure code in Ukraine, which has been on the table pretty much since 2003 when I came back to Ukraine. But, it's like most other things. Everybody wants reform when they're not in power. And once you get into power, you don't want a code that's going to put limits on discretion and limit the powers of bureaucrats, and let's just put that off a little bit. We like the administrative command control system, and so it was. After I came back just after the Orange Revolution in 2005, and I became advisor to Prime Minister Timoshenko in her first incarnation on public administration reform, because now I was an expert. Like they say in the practice of law, the difference between a novice and an expert is one deal. And so I was the only person crazy enough to have been doing any of this stuff. And so they so I was brought in, but I never had a client less interested in anything I had to say. I remember one of my first meetings with her when I was excited, like she was like a goddess for us, that she was right on the front lines of the Orange Revolution. And she's quite authoritarian. And so I'm talking to her about, public administration reform, transparency, accountability, delivery of effective public services, and the importance of decentralization, that you have to decentralize power from the center to the municipalities to give them more tax raising and let people, economic growth. And I can see that she's like turning black. And she leaned over the table at me and she looked at me right now. She goes, Daniel Bilak, do you really want to destroy this country? And all of a sudden I got like cold sweat. I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I just say? What did I just say? This is like textbook stuff. What's going on? And I went, no, not really. And she starts talking about, the centralized power and everything else. I'm thinking, oh my God, what are we going to do? I said, okay, so public administration, I thought to myself, let's start at the other end of the tunnel. Let's start with the delivery of services, that we need to deliver better services. And she says, now you understand. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be a disaster. And it was. She didn't last that long. But then I went back into the Ministry of Justice because my former minister, my friend Sergio Lovate, became minister again. And this time we started doing more, getting deeper into judicial reform and all of that kind of stuff, really putting things forward. But it was really challenging because the ministry had changed quite a bit in the 8 years since I'd been there last. It was much more sophisticated, but there was also much more going on in the area of corruption. And this was really interesting to me. I remember one of my first days in the ministry, because I was the chief of staff again, sort of the gatekeeper to the minister. And I had these two businessmen come to visit me. And I said, you got a great minister, a real reformer. You guys knock yourselves out. But there's this state company that's under the Ministry of Justice. Just don't look there. Don't look there at all. It's not really interesting to you. And I thought, oh my God. He goes, and we will give you $25,000, you and the minister, $25,000 a month if you don't look there. And I'm just like flabbergasted. And I'm like sputtering. I'm okay. And so I'm thinking, like, what do I do? So I went to Sergio and I said, what do we do? And he said, I don't know. What do we do? You're my advisor. You tell me. I said, okay, do we go to the Procuratura? Do we go to the SBU? Which of these agencies? Who knows if they're involved? And so I thought, you know what? Let's play these guys out a little bit. And so they came back and I said to them, the minister finds your proposal unacceptable. So you read into that what you want. They, of course, read into it right away that it wasn't enough. So they said 50,000. So I sent them packing. And then we started an investigation that I headed up inside the ministry, an internal investigation. It was really sort of. And I actually found an honest former police officer that went right inside. And when we finished the investigation and I realized that we could have asked for $200,000 a month and they would have paid it, no problem. This was the agency, this was a company that did all of the auctions, so-called public auctions for confiscated property that the bailiffs in Ukraine had confiscated. So it was quite interesting. After that, I went back into private practice. I was the managing partner of a London, England-based international law firm, CMS Cameron McKenna, and I did that for about 7 years. And then I was asked by Prime Minister Groisman to head up Ukraine Invest, which I did for 3 years. And that was after the Maidan. The Maidan was really, it was the watershed for Ukraine. It was the tipping point. Because we really Ukraine only started building a modern European state after the Maidan. It's when we really got serious about reform. Everybody talks about the corruption, but what they don't talk about is all of the, and for most people, fighting corruption is go and find the bad guys and lock them up. I mean, that gives everybody a bit of an endorphin high, and they're all excited about it. And, in fact, a lot of, disappointingly, many people in our diaspora were quite down on Ukraine on the whole corruption stuff. And it was very hard for me to try to show them all of the things that we had done institutionally to actually fight corruption, because that's how you fight corruption long term. You build institutions. Fighting corruption is very simple. You shine light in dark corners. And so it's all about building process and procedures that enhance transparency, that enhance accountability, that enhance service delivery, these democratic governance principles that I've been bleeding on about for already almost 20 years. And we did a lot of that. We started a public, all of the Ukraine's public finances went online. We started the Prozoro procurement system, which won awards. I didn't even know you got awards for a public procurement system, but apparently you do. In fact, the French government wanted to buy the technology, the way that we had done that. So all of the public procurement was now done transparently. There were lots of things. The Ukrainian government, Prime Minister Groisman, got very serious about decentralization. They actually passed the laws that were necessary to do that. We started healthcare reform, education reform. My kids here go to a public school in our village. I live in a village outside of Kyiv, and they're now on a new curriculum and very modern. It's got TV sets and the paint with your fingers or whatever. I don't even.
The smart boards.
Smart boards. Thank you very much. And so it's still a lot of problems. But one of the things I found very, very frustrating when you live here is that everybody makes the perfect the enemy of the good. And Ukraine is always held to some higher standard that we were all infected with in Ukrainian school, that somehow we're next to God, and we have to be higher and more moral than everybody else. And when you look at in the neighborhood and what goes on in Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Italy, Greece, Portugal, I would argue that we should be in the EU because we have EU levels of corruption. But we don't talk about the things that have been done and the great strides and the steps that have taken place. The fact that we have, the visa-free regime with the EU is huge. People just talk about, oh, well, Ukraine is hemorrhaging workers because they're all going to Poland. Yeah, but a lot of them are coming back. Wages are going up. They're going up 20% year on year. We didn't have as far to fall as everybody else did in COVID. So actually, our economic decline is going to be about zero. Well, we're even out where we were at the start of the year because the economy is going up. We feed the world. That's been our saving grace. I'm involved right now with my firm in major public infrastructure projects, redoing ports, roads, where I'm just on a call before I got on with you about a major highway concession project, 6-lane highway to join Kyiv with the Rivne, because there's already a highway to Rivne from Kyiv, but 300 kilometers from Rivne to the Polish border. So all of this stuff goes on, but we only get the bad news because that's what people want to read. And that's what goes into the echo chamber. And that's what the Russians in their troll factories in St. Petersburg keep pumping out day after day. Anyway, that was a really long answer to a very short question, for which I apologize. I told you at the beginning, you got to cut me off.
Well, I thought your answer was very interesting. I've got maybe 25 questions, but just for the sake of time for this recorded portion, I'm not going to ask them.
Yeah.
And I'll move on to the actual, the next question that I have written down. But I do have questions for you, maybe for later. So my next question is, how do you think your involvement in your Ukrainian Student Club, so USK or SUSK, helped you in advancing your career and or personal development?
Well, it certainly taught me how to negotiate. It taught me about sorting out important matters from petty matters, that not every matter you need to, go to the wall on, which, when you're in a students club, every issue that one of your members brings you is a matter of life and death for them. So you have to sort of validate, yes, this is important, but really try to manage that person's expectations. It taught me a lot about leadership at a very formative period in my life. It taught me that leadership is not easy. It taught me that as I said, you have to broker a lot of different interests, but you have to try to keep your eye on the ball. You got to have an overall uniting or convening objective that you can rally people behind. And that's really it's about getting people behind you to pursue a common goal that they may not entirely want to do. And if you can bring those people that say, well, what do I need this for, etc., but give them a little bit of a piece of what they're this is really important. Why don't you try this? What are you interested in? And then you try to build this coherent team that, especially among your executive, very diverse people. Everybody has an opinion, especially when you're a student, because there's no penalty for having any opinion, or apparently there is these days. I probably couldn't even get into a university at this point. Those were very important lessons for me. And despite my X-course a few minutes ago, it taught me that you can't be doing all the talking all the time. You've got to listen to other people. You've got to bring in other points of view, and you've got to try to build as much of a consensus as you can around the right thing to do, but at the same time push people in the direction that you think we should go. Doesn't mean you can't change your mind. I changed my mind lots of times. There are lots of people who have excellent ideas, and we sort of change. But you got to start at the beginning by setting objectives that everybody can buy into, because then the rest is strategy. It's how we get there. If you don't have an objective, everything that you do is just process. That's like the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was all about process. It wasn't about results. So when you become a leader of any organization, you have to set yourself a goal. What is it that I want to achieve by the end of my term? And what do I want to leave? When I was at Ukraine-Invest, one of the most important, there were three objectives that I set for myself. I learned this at USK. I mean, this is still the same, whether I was a managing partner of an international law firm in Ukraine, whether I was involved in the in Hromadske organizacji. It's the same thing. What's the objective? And at Ukraine-Invest, I set myself three objectives. One was to turn existing investors into happy campers, so that they will go on and evangelize Ukraine to new investors. The second objective was to attract new investors so that we can build very good, stories. But I had to do the first before I did the second. And for me, one of the most important things was that when I succeeded on those first two, it was really important that after I left, there was an institution that was sustainable, that my organization was now institutionalized into the body politic of the government apparatus. Now that can be a dangerous thing to do as well, because you get lost in the bureaucracy. So as not just chairman of Ukraine Invest, but as the I reported directly to the prime minister, and I was his chief advisor on investments. And so it was important for me to maintain, to even when because he left, the government changed, President Dzulynsky came in, there was a new team, et cetera, et cetera. So I had already had, about 9 months earlier, started this institutionalization process. And it was very important for me that Ukraine Invest remain under the prime minister, that the head of Ukraine Invest, whatever the director or chairman, chairperson, whatever the title would be, would still be the prime minister's trusted person, whether they had the title of advisor or whatever, it didn't matter. You had to have that access, because that's where you get things done. That's where you help investors. That's where you unblock problems. And so that objective was really, really uppermost on my mind throughout. It was, what am I leaving behind? What's the not just my legacy, but how is this thing going to have a life after I leave? And that is the problem with most Ukrainian initiatives, or initiatives involving anything to do with the Ukrainian government. They all die after, when the government changes, for one, and when when the head guy leaves, or girl, lady. So this was really important, and so I started building these networks. And this is really another thing that I learned at Ukrainian Students Club, is the importance of networks. You're going into investment banking. This is going to be the single most important asset that you have. Your education's great. You're going to do well. You're going to get top grades, etc. But if you don't have a network that you can leverage into creating something that will help you achieve your objectives, it's going to be very difficult for you. So the idea is to create, it's not about using people, but it's about meeting people, getting them on board with what you're doing, and then getting them to help you. And so it was like vishitya, I was embroidering the 3 years that I was chairman of Ukraine Invest. And you're embroidering this sorochka that you're hoping, that's got nitke, threads from different stakeholders, from embassies, from business associations, from existing investors, from new investors, from government, people inside the government, not ministers, because ministers are very fungible, they come and they go. What you want is the buy-in from that senior middle level, director general level, because those people don't change. They don't change very often. And so it's important that those institutional zvyazki, those institutional ties, are developed there. And I had the same thing. We had a major controversy that I was actually on, I think I was on the right side, but I was on the lonely side of. And that was when the appointment of Professor Paul Moguchi at the chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto. It was horribly controversial. And I was one of the very few, and as head of SUSK, I was expected to sort of lead the charge against him, because he wasn't Ukrainian enough. He was favorably disposed to the Rusin group in Zakarpattia. He didn't speak Ukrainian well, and all this kind of stuff. And there were people, very senior people in SUSK, actually, that were very angry with me. And other people in the Ukrainian Students Club. And so I took his course. I decided I was going to go on the front lines. I took his course so that I could actually talk about what he was like as an academic. Because for me, that was the most, he had phenomenal credentials. I mean, he had unbelievable credentials. And he was an excellent professor. He still is. And I see him time from time when I'm back in Toronto. But there were a few of us that stuck up, but it was, sometimes you have to do what's right, what you feel is right, even if everybody else is feels that you're wrong, and you have to take a stand. I couldn't be impeached, but they knew that I was leaving at the end of the year. So you're just going to wait it out sort of thing. It never came to that. I mean, we had heated discussions, but it wasn't anything, it wasn't terrible antipathy. We were still friends with most of those people that we had, but it was quite an emotional and emotive issue. And I just felt that it wasn't fair. First of all, I thought that okay, we have to look at what are the criteria for that position, right? Let's take emotion out of it. What are the criteria? Does he meet the criteria? It's not our call anyway, it's the university's call. And so for us to protest and everything else, we can beat our heads against the wall. It's not going to change anybody's mind. So let's see how we make this work for us, And, Professor Margochi has produced some outstanding books. He's produced a huge survey of Ukraine, of Ukrainian history. He produced an excellent historical study of the maps at different stages depicting Ukraine. And, I think it worked out. I think that I was on the right side of history at the end of the day. But that was an important lesson to me because I had a choice to make. Do I go with the crowd that I didn't believe in? If I had believed in it, then I would have led them. But it was an awkward position for me for the last 6 months of my being head of SUSK because here I am. I'm supposed to lead. I'm supposed to, but I tried to explain my position. I said, okay, let's put that issue aside and let's move on with the other stuff.
That's interesting. So, kind of was the idea that you would. I'm just curious. Would you protest against him? How is that going to work?
There were protests. There were letters. It was in the community. It was a huge issue. People who I thought were, very professionally, doctors, lawyers, etc. People were just getting so emotional and so. It was a bit crazy actually in some respects. Like this was about fighting for the liberation of Ukraine. They felt that he would not have a Ukrainian enough perspective, notwithstanding the fact that he was the top student of Omelian Pretsak from Harvard, who ran the chair of Ukrainian studies at Harvard and was like the ultimate Ukrainian professor. Paul Grabovich, also from Rutgers, was very, very complimentary. So he had huge support in academia among Ukrainian academics, but it was outside of that people wanted the comfort. It made me feel that we're kind of prisoners of our own distorted history. Because we distort our own history. And we don't like sometimes we don't like the truths that we have to face in our history. And that's across the board in Eastern Europe. This is not a Ukrainian thing. You talk to anybody, and some of those truths are very, very hard. So we have to talk about those. But to say that I'm sorry you don't qualify, notwithstanding all your academic achievements, you don't qualify because you are not Ukrainian enough. It wasn't really an argument. I wasn't brought up that way.
That's actually a conversation we've been having with our student clubs and within SUSK, kind of making sure there's no right type of Ukrainian, and that we're inclusive of all types of Ukrainians, whether they speak the language, what religion they are, regardless of any attributes.
Yeah, and I think that's the role of a student club. The role is, it can be a glee club if you want, but if you want to have a serious discussion about what it is, and it evolves, a discussion of what it is to be Ukrainian today in Canada, a Ukrainian-Canadian, is very different than it would have been in my time. You have a lot more novopribuli. You have a lot more students who are born in Canada to immigrants, and just as my generation was, but for some reason those immigrants aren't, Canadian enough. They're too Ukrainian. So it's sometimes you get into very odd conversations. They haven't paid their dues. Just like insane. The guy's got a PhD in chemical engineering. What kind of dues? Supposed to drive a taxi? What a horrible waste of of talent. I have the same issue in, I'm involved in the Orthodox Church. I was involved in, actually, I had a role to play in bringing the Tomos to Ukraine, and an establishment of a Ukrainian Orthodox Church here. And what a lot of people don't appreciate is the role that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada played in that. It played a very important role in convincing the ecumenical patriarch to reach out to what was then the Kiev Patriarchate and to grant the Tomos at the end of the day. Metropolitan Yuri played a crucial role. But yet the church is at a crossroads in Canada. And, you have membership fees that generally older people who have been members for years and years and years pay, and they get to vote on what goes on. But Novopribuli, when they come, there's not the tradition in Ukraine. Nobody pays membership fees to a church. You just go, and if you need to vote, you just vote, because everybody knows who's members of the church. And so then there's a discussion: how do we make the Ukrainian Orthodox Church more inclusive of these people? And that's going to be a challenge for its future. So these kinds of issues are across the board. They're not just in a students' club or in a church or in an academic institution. I mean, this is the reality of who we are today in Canada. You know more about that than I do.
I guess maybe I do. I have one last question. I think this probably was already answered, but do you have any last tips for students? And they might be, career tips, Ukrainian community involvement tips, or anything you see that is important to share.
Hear the person you're talking to. Hear the person you're talking to. Be tolerant, be respectful, and be fair, be true, and have fun.
Okay, well, short and sweet.
Yeah, I mean, you look at what's happening on campuses now, at least from our perspective here, with microaggressions and all this kind of stuff. I'm not minimizing. I'm not being politically incorrect or whatever, but there is a really strong debate to be had about what constitutes free speech and what are the parameters around free speech. And the way I was brought up by my parents was that, look, you just treat people with dignity. If you listen to the other person, you respect what they have to say. There are a lot of people that I can't talk to anymore because, or people who, for example, promote Ruski Mir. As they say in Russian, нам надо говорить на общий язык. We have to have a common language. We have to have a shared set of principles and values for us to have a conversation, even if we don't agree. And so you see what's happening in the United States, that you have this cacophony where people have just started to hate each other for their politics, and it's like you are evil and baby eaters and traffic. I mean, it's nuts. But you have it here as well. You have a lot of people that it's very difficult to listen to people that propagate the Russian view of history of Ukraine. So the easy thing for me is I just don't have those discussions. But for people who I do respect and who I don't have, which is 99% of the people, I'm interested in what they have to say, because, as much as I'm here and I've been plugged in and I've had the honor of being part of not just observing but participating in the building of a nation. It's actually quite humbling. It's actually quite humbling because you see that a nation is built brick by brick by the efforts of ordinary people, and people who are struggling to understand their place in the world, because they were born, especially my generation, or in their 40s or in 20, or the generation behind me, were still born in the Soviet Union. They were taught a completely different thing. When you look at people your age now in Ukraine, they're born in independent Ukraine. They don't have all of that baggage that I have from my upbringing, the guilt that we're associated with, survivor's guilt and everything else that our parents carried over, or their parents' issues about, what the values of the Soviet Union. They don't struggle with any of that. They're on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all over the world. The difference, I used to say, the difference between somebody my age in Canada, Germany, and Ukraine growing up, culturally, politically, economically, was as wide as a bus. It was huge. The difference between you, somebody your age in Germany, or somebody your age in Ukraine, is the width of your hand. You share so much more of the values of your generation together because you're all connected. This is where the network comes important. You have an opportunity, your generation has an opportunity to leverage your networks and build networks that mine doesn't even still know how to use. Never mind, let alone plug in or whatever. For us, learning how to use Zoom is a major accomplishment. So that issue of, and I've seen it here because we've gone through revolutions. We're in a war. There's a very high premium when you have conflict in society on listening to other people and treating people with dignity and respect, because you can lose everything. I mean, I remember when I was in 2014, I was the advisor to the governor of Donetsk Oblast and Serhiy Taruta, and so I was involved in a lot of meetings here in Ukraine with foreigners, that ministers and prime ministers of other countries and stuff that other people weren't. And so I was privy to information that I was sitting in July of 2014. I was sitting on my terrace with my wife, beautiful warm July summer day, working out our evacuation plan. Having a whiskey, having a cigar, working out our evacuation plan. Do we go through? I still have my responsibility to my office? So she would take the little kids. We had little kids. She would take them, put them in the car, go to Poland. There, I said the airports are going to be closed. So we were faced with a possible invasion that night. I knew about that, and I didn't know whether the next day Russian soldiers were going to have their feet up on my terrace. And where was I going to be? I was working out an evacuation plan for my office to go to Poland. And you live out here with a sense of vulnerability that you don't have in Canada. And this is the great danger, I think, of democracy, is that I have the sense that democratic societies have become complacent, that somehow they're entitled to the freedoms that you enjoy. And that ain't the case. You have to fight for justice and freedom every single day. And I think that's what, why Ukraine is growing, is developing, and why it will continue to do so, is that people never give up. And that's probably another takeaway for your colleagues, is never give up. The measure, Carlyle, I think, said, English philosopher, that the measure of the man, said man back then, I can't say that anymore, but the measure of the person is how the measure of greatness of a person is how you treat the little people. And it also means that when you fall, it's how you get up that matters. And that when you live with vulnerability, you start to question a lot of things and you appreciate a lot more. I think more than anything else, I turned 60 this year. So that's kind of a milestone. And somebody asked me, sum up how you feel. And I thought about it. I said, grateful. I think my overwhelming emotion at this stage of my life is gratitude. That I've been given an opportunity to do things that, nobody Not many people have been. Not many people probably want to. But I did it, and I did it on my own terms. But I was helped a lot along the way by friends, by family, by people I met along the way. And that journey is the one that defines you as a person. And we're alive, we're healthy, and for you guys, yeah, it sucks right now because you're stuck in your parents' house when you'd rather be going to a frat house or a sorority for a party, which I totally get. I mean, I feel sorry for you, but you know what? We'll come out of this. That what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, and you'll go on and do great things. Your generation will go on and do great things. I'm betting on that.
Sounds good. I just want to say, дуже дякую. It was great to hear from you, and I'm sure others will also enjoy hearing about you and your experience. Слава Україні! Героям слава!
Героям слава! Дякую за нагоду з вами поспілкуватися.